Today, I want to talk about Nintendo Switch Online going into 2024 and specifically what we need to see from Nintendo in terms of value-added services as they continue to attempt to grow this subscription that, by all accounts, even according to their own direct numbers at investor meetings, is extremely successful for them. In fact, they are touting over 38 million members between the base tier and expansion pack as of September 30th, 2023. Which is their most recent citing on where they're at within the service, and we know the kind of revenue this drives to Nintendo's bottom line. So how are they going to reinvest that to continue to grow the service and in turn convert more of the 130 plus million Switch users that are out there to see this service as something that is worth spending your hard-earned money on? And as we come to a close in 2023 at the time of filming this video, we actually did see a lot of content updates for Nintendo Switch Online, kicking it off in a big way in the early part of the year at the February Nintendo Direct, when we got the confirmation that the Game Boy family of systems would be dropping into the service. Of course, you had the Game Boy and Game Boy Color technically just being one app added into the base tier service for that $20 annual price point. And then you had Game Boy Advance being added into the expansion pack tier, which does come at the higher $50 annual price point for an individual membership. The updates for Nintendo Switch Online are anything but consistent, and that's really going to continue to be one of my gripes as we walk forward into the service until we get any kind of clear-cut communication from Nintendo that maybe they're just holding themselves to some kind of standard of a minimum amount of games per month that they will add in. But it seems like we're always left guessing. Sometimes we go multiple months with no updates. Sometimes we get a massive brand new update out of nowhere, like we recently saw them do with N64 games, where they added in 3 games on the same date: 1080 Snowboarding, Jet Force Gemini, and Harvest Moon 64. But in general, it is always a guessing game with Nintendo Switch Online, and I definitely feel like the Game Boy family of systems, while they were the big value add for the early part of 2023, they definitely fell off as the year progressed. The Zelda Oracle games were a big highlight for me when those were both added in at the same time. Metroid Fusion was added in shortly after the Game Boy family of systems were announced, but overall, I feel like when it comes to the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance library of games that they could have chosen from, I feel like we could have seen a lot more updates on those particular consoles in 2023. When it comes to N64 games and what we saw Nintendo do this year in 2023, we saw them do a lot of sporadic updates. In fact, more so than we've ever seen them do with N64 in the past. We initially saw Nintendo stick to a loose commitment of one new N64 game per calendar month, every single month like clockwork, when they started adding in games to the N64 when it was added into the expansion pack back in October of 2021. Then at the September 2022 Direct, when we did indeed get an updated roadmap of games for the N64 library, and Nintendo noted that they would be adding them gradually over the course of time, it was apparent that that wording was being used because maybe they're adjusting the frequency at which they will add in N64 games to the expansion pack, and that's sure enough what we saw them do, sometimes going 2, 3, almost even 4 months at one point, if I'm not mistaken, without seeing a new N64 game. And then lo and behold, we talk about the most recent updates where they're dropping 3 all at once. So I do think that N64 has come into that time in its life cycle where the games are going to be sporadically added. And that's kind of where I want to start with point number 1 in terms of what we should expect to see from the service in 2024. And it's actually one that is kind of a coin toss for me on whether or not we will see Nintendo do anything at the upcoming Direct, which has to do with a games roadmap. I think it makes a lot of sense to do a games roadmap, but I don't necessarily know that they will revisit that for the N64. I almost feel like we are now in the territory with this console where they will just sporadically pick a game and throw it into the service, and they're not really going to communicate with us ahead of time on what's around the corner. I could be wrong about that, and I would love to be wrong about that because I actually like to know what big titles are around the corner at some point in time. But like I mentioned with the September Direct one, it took them well over a year to add in like the 9 games that they had featured there. So the roadmaps don't mean that much to begin with anyway, but I do think that there's a high likelihood that N64 continues to get expanded in a big way, and I think that they're going to pick some gem titles in 2024 2024. I think games like Super Smash Bros. With online play will be a thing. It will be something that we are able to experience. I also think that there's now a lot of rare titles that are actually on the table with additions like Jet Force Gemini recently. Why would you not add in games like Donkey Kong 64, Diddy Kong Racing, potentially Perfect Dark, now that M-rated games are definitely on the table, maybe even Conker's Bad Fur Day? Nintendo in multiple regions around the world has actually developed a separate 18+ app for the Nintendo 64 library due to the rating systems. And while we don't have that here in the United States, there's no reason to think that Nintendo wouldn't throw us one of those apps as well if we start to talk about certain mature rated games over here. When you talk about Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games, well, Nintendo's not necessarily done with the existing roadmaps that we have. I'm hopeful that by the February Direct, they will be done with those additions, and maybe we will indeed get a look at both the Game Boy family of systems, upcoming roadmap of games, and potentially even N64. And while you're at it, Nintendo, maybe you could handpick a few of the missing NES and SNES, a lot of the licensed games that we're just missing, maybe even throw in some kind of a sneak peek roadmap to those systems as well. Although, again, communication in Nintendo around NSO is just not something we've historically seen, so I'm not holding my breath for new updated roadmaps, but I do think it's on the table of things that we will see Nintendo focus on in 2024. Now, from there, I want to pivot the conversation to the more exciting part, which is not confirmed by any stretch of the imagination, but there is a lot of reason to believe that Nintendo is gearing up to launch the successor to the Nintendo Switch in 2024. If they do, I do personally believe we will see a revamped version of Nintendo Switch Online, hopefully with some big core features that have just been missing this entire time. Let's ditch friend codes and replace them with the Nintendo User ID username so you can add friends that way. Let's create some kind of onboard messaging system so you can tell your friend to get online on a game that you are currently on, and you can communicate clearly via chat, and that should exist both in text form and voice chat. In a perfect world, Nintendo would just opt to do what Sony and Microsoft have done and support Discord app functionality on the next generation hardware, but there's no telling that they will do that, although I think it would make a lot of sense because you could obviously do parental controls for the Discord app, and then it's technically taking the responsibility off Nintendo because it's just an app they have available on their console. It's not something that they are supporting at the core level themselves, but knowing Nintendo, they may continue this wacky idea that you have to have a smartphone and download the Nintendo Switch Online app and talk to your friends that way. I am hopeful that's a thing of the past with a revamped version of NSO, but I do think that we will get some kind of notable across the board upgrade when it comes to the base feature set when we are talking about Nintendo Switch Online rolling forward to the next generation hardware, which we know, according to Nintendo themselves, will take place. They specifically have shown slides where Nintendo account and value added services, aka Nintendo Switch Online, and while they didn't name drop that, it's kind of insinuated that that's what value added services is. Anyway, that's going to roll forward, no doubt. We're not hitting the reset button and starting from scratch when it comes to a next gen platform, and that is a very good news situation because we don't have to wait for Nintendo to re-add these games again on the next platform. They're all just going to be there, and hopefully with some big online profile changes to boot, like messaging and voice chat, and hopefully even some kind of trophy system. I know not everybody's a fan of those. I love the trophy and achievement things between Xbox and PlayStation, and certain games I go out of my way to do extra things and spend potentially 20 or 30 extra hours in a game that I wouldn't have spent otherwise, just so I can show off that platinum trophy when I'm all done with it. I think it would make a ton of sense for Nintendo to incorporate something like that as well, and I'm hopeful they do. The biggest and most exciting part of what we might see Nintendo do in 2024 with Nintendo Switch Online has to do, of course, with new systems that we have not seen mentioned so far. We don't know for a fact that Nintendo will continue the train like they've done so far with going further and further into their library, such as GameCube being the next logical step in the timeline in terms of Nintendo consoles, or you could even argue DS and Wii would be in that conversation as well. DS is something that will be interesting to see how Nintendo handles it because clearly a lot of those games, if not all of them, have a big touchscreen component to them. And if you have your Switch docked, of course, you're not going to have access to the touchscreen on the device. So does Nintendo release some kind of unique controller where it looks like it's a 3DS or a DS type of controller, but you actually do have a touchscreen on it, so all of those games work seamlessly, and it's something that's sold through them from the Nintendo store, and that's kind of how you have to play those games, or will they just solve for it with motion controls that you can do with a pop-up touchscreen that pops up, like software based? It'll be interesting to see how they tackle that one. I do think at some point in time we will be talking about DS and 3DS games being added in, but I think more likely is first GameCube. I think that's next up on the list, and I think when Nintendo does drop that into the service, we might potentially be seeing yet another price increase in terms of the overall cost, and it will be interesting to see if they go to the 3-tier model like we kind of see PlayStation do currently, where there's the essentials, extra, and then ultimately the premium. So we'll see what Nintendo ends up doing with all of that. But GameCube, I think, absolutely is on the table next for their next generation hardware. You could argue that Wii would fall into that same situation, since they're really similar in terms of the graphical components as far as GameCube versus Wii games. Like, the Wii was literally just a slightly beefed up GameCube. There's no reason from a technical standpoint that you couldn't put Wii games on the Switch or Switch 2 very easily, just because the motion controls work flawlessly with the Joy-Cons, and a lot of that library would transfer over with no problem. But I do think that Nintendo will separate these out, and we're not going to wake up and see GameCube and Wii announced at the same time, but we will get GameCube added in first with a roadmap of games, and then Nintendo will slowly drip feed us those. Then eventually they're going to go to Wii next and add in those. I don't necessarily think that they both happen in 2024, but if new console hardware does indeed launch in 2024, I think GameCube is absolutely on the table, and I think that we might even see it be the big selling point for why you want to sign up for that service, the highest tier, whatever it is, if it's the expansion pack or something else, when the new console hardware launches. I think it almost might be something that is launched immediately after Nintendo does indeed drop that new system, and that's what I'm hoping for, because clearly the GameCube library games, that holds a special place in my heart. If I could play Double Dash online with the touched up visuals of NSO, like, absolutely 10 out of 10 must buy service for me. So outside of those few predictions and a little bit of a historical breakdown of what Nintendo did with NSO in 2023, that's where I really want to hear from you guys. I want to hear your personal thoughts and predictions and opinions on what you think we will see Nintendo do with Nintendo Switch Online in 2024, and what are you most hopeful we see added? Do you think there's a chance that GameCube is coming to the service in that year and it will be launched alongside of new console hardware? Do you think maybe Nintendo launches their new console next year, but they don't do anything massive to NSO in 2024 at all, and we're not talking about any major new systems until 2025 at the earliest? And what games, whether they be from systems that are playable or not playable, are you most excited to see added in to the service in some way, shape, or form? So regardless of your thoughts and feelings on everything we talked about today, I do look forward to hearing from you all in the comments down below before we leave the video, as I do look forward to getting a back and forth conversation started with you all around these topics. Go watch the video on screen next if you haven't already. Also, make sure you like, subscribe, turn on your notification bell, and I will see you guys in the next video.